What's up, everybody? For this video, I'm going to be doing a kind of a tank guide. While I will be using Final Fantasy XIV for the example, the ideas in the video really apply to any game where you have the group dynamic of DPS heals and tank roles, where you have one party member that's dedicated as the tank to control the enemies. You may have heard it called the Holy Trinity. The key points that I'll be covering are pulling and positioning of mobs using your cooldowns, watching out for enemy mechanics, and one of the most important ones that gets overlooked is being aware of the other members of your party. We going over trash versus boss fights. I would say the most important thing is your knowledge of the encounters. So knowing the mechanics of the different enemies is pretty important. I think I'll start with the team aspect so it doesn't interrupt when we go through actually playing as the tank. Number one is the DPS. In general, higher DPS means it's easier to pull more, or it allows a wider margin of error because the mobs die faster. So if you mess up, it doesn't really hurt you as the tank as much. If your DPS is high, you can rest assured that some mobs will be dead within the span of a cooldown. As DPS gets lower, you might have to chain cooldowns together to facilitate the amount of time it takes to bring down mobs, particularly if you have a large group. When working out a pull, one of the most important things to remember is that healers are casters. So most heals require a cast time to go off. If you pull too much or don't mitigate a tank buster move properly, you could essentially get one shot before the healer has a chance to get your health back up. You also need to be aware if you're training mobs, as in pulling a train of mobs, you also need to be aware of running too far ahead of your healer while they might be trying to cast a heal on you. They top you off or whatever, so you can keep pulling. You might leave them behind and end up dying because of that. Some people may also be a little overzealous and try to run ahead of you. There are two responses to this. You can either deal with it and just round up the mobs as best you can, or you just keep sticking to your plan, assuming it's a dungeon that you've done maybe a few times, you know the pulls, and you just keep going through it and just let the DPS pull what they're going to pull if they want to go ahead. And if they die, that's their problem. Personally, if DPS pulls and letting them take it won't wipe the group, I'll just go that route. And if they are aware enough, they should run to you so you can hit the mobs and take the aggro off of them. If the healer gets aggro, usually make sure to grab those, because the healer might have a regen on you, and that will pull aggro when you're trying to round up mobs that you are just getting to and maybe haven't hit yet. The healer can also get busy healing themselves, which means they're not healing you. So basically, in summary, just be aware of your party members, particularly the healer, as that's the person that's going to be keeping you alive while you're taking the brunt of the attacks. Also, some moves are not aimed at the tank. That's something for people to remember. People get mad when they die to a mechanic. They're like, what was the tank doing? Not every move is targeted at the tank or the person with the most aggro. And like I said before, higher DPS makes it safer to make larger pulls. So you gotta be aware of that. Know how long you are gonna have to stand and take hits before the mobs start going down. So next we're gonna look at the actual tanking cooldowns. I'll be using Gunbreaker for this video. But the rules apply to all tanks. Tanks in every game will have some kind of damage mitigating traits or abilities. That's what helps them fill the tanking role, being able to control the mobs and have all the threat and take the hits. In Final Fantasy XIV, each tank has a toggleable ability. It's basically like a switch that increases your enmity, which is basically their aggro system. In essence, it makes all the mobs hate you the most for a minimal amount of effort. They kind of take the stress out of keeping aggro on all the mobs. In the case of Gunbreaker, it's called Royal Guard. For Paladin, it's Iron Will. I have not played Warrior, so I don't know what that one's called. And I've done Dark Knight a little bit, but usually Gunbreaker is my main tank. A couple other shared tanking abilities are Reprisal and Rampart. So in Final Fantasy XIV, you have roles, which would be tank, heal, physical DPS, and magical DPS. So all the tanks share a few abilities. The two mitigation abilities are Reprisal and Rampart. They also all have a stun. These are simply generic tanking cooldowns. One increases your defense. That would be Rampart. The other lowers the damage that the enemy puts out. That's Reprisal. Other Gunbreaker cooldowns are Nebula, which is just another damage mitigation ability. Rampart reduces damage taken by 20%. Nebula reduces damage taken by 30%. I'll get into that in a second. Camouflage increases your parry rate to 100%, which reduces the damage of hits that you take by 15%. So you have a certain time frame where you're parrying every attack, which reduces those attacks' damage by 15%. And you also take 10% flat reduced damage while you're under the effect of camouflage. Aurora is just a heal. It's a regen type heal, a heal over time. You can cast it on party members, not just yourself. Heart of Stone is just another damage reduction. I think it's 10%. Heart of Light, reduce magic damage taken by all party members in the area. So when you use Heart of Light, it's kind of like Reprisal, but instead of affecting the enemy's damage output, it affects your party member's damage input on magic damage. And Super Bolide is like the oh shit button. It makes you impervious to pretty much any attack and reduces your HP to 1. So basically you want to use that when you're kind of low health and you want to buy some time to let the healer get your health back up and maybe top you off. So we have our threat buff. We're familiar with the cooldowns. So now it's time to start pulling. But wait, just throwing this in there, Final Fantasy XIV does have a food system, and food gives it XP buff, so always make sure you're eating food, if for nothing else than just having the XP buff. There isn't really much to actually pulling the mobs, as you just have to run the dungeons, get used to how the groups are laid out, how they aggro, and their pathing and stuff like that. Something to remember when pulling is to avoid having enemies pointed at your party. One thing I will mention for pulling, all of the tank classes have a ranged ability which grants high threat, so you can start with that. If there's one mob like off to the side and a couple other on the other side, you can hit the isolated one with your ranged ability, so you're close to the other mobs to hit them with your AoE. Sometimes it's good to use this to get a boost on your threat, so you can continue running without having to worry about somebody pulling the aggro off you. There are many factors that go into how big a pull you should do. Do you have any cooldowns up? Is your equipment like top notch, or are you just barely at your level requirement? And your party makeup, like I said at the beginning. Some general rules I use are, if there are more than 3 enemies, you want to make sure you use cooldowns until at least 1 or 2 of them dies. Try not to stack your cooldowns. You may want to do this on particularly bad situations, but for the most part, say if I start with Nebula, if a mob does 1,000 damage, when I pop Nebula, it's only going to do 700 damage. So then if I use Rampart, it's not going to take an additional 200 damage off like it would if I was only using Rampart. It's going to take 20% of 700 damage, which would look like 140, something like that. So I mean, it's not, it's still does reduce the damage that you take, but it's less effective if you're stacking it on top of another cooldown of the same type. But if I use Nebula and then I use Reprisal to lower the damage that the mobs do, I'm still getting the full 30% reduced from the mob's damage. So if I use Reprisal, it's a 10% damage reduction. They would be doing 900 damage. So I would take 30% off of that. And then if I use Rampart, I would take 20% off of the remainder. Hope that makes sense for everybody. So you want to try not to stack cooldowns unless it's a particularly hairy situation and you need as much damage reduction as you can possibly get. But generally, using cooldowns concurrently diminishes their effectiveness. So you want to chain them together, maybe not let it fall off completely where you might have that window of being one shot by the number of mobs. So then we'll just do, I think this is the Siren Song C dungeon. So we're just gonna do a run through of this and see it all in action.